Somewhere in France, in the last dark hour before dawn, on a Friday morning in October of the year 1307, a man is sleeping. He is not a king. He is not a lord. He is a middle-aged brother of a religious order, lying on a thin straw mattress in a small stone room that smells faintly of tallow candles and old wool. His white mantle hangs on a wooden peg by the door. His shoes sit side by side beneath it, worn soft at the heels from years of walking the same corridors, the same courtyards, the same quiet paths between the chapel and the stables. He has lived most of his life by a bell. The bell wakes him in the night for prayers. The bell calls him to meals he eats in silence. The bell tells him when to work, when to rest, when to sleep. For decades, the shape of his days has been as steady and predictable as the turning of a water wheel. And in a few minutes, all of that will end forever. Down the road, in the darkness, the king's men are already moving. Sealed orders, opened only hours before, are being read by torchlight in towns all across the kingdom. Thousands of soldiers and officials are converging quietly on farmhouses and manor houses and city compounds, every property belonging to the Order of the Temple. By the time the sun rises, almost every Templar in France will be under arrest. The wealthiest, most powerful, most trusted religious order in the Western world, bankers to kings, guardians of pilgrims, veterans of 2 centuries of war in the Holy Land, will be accused of crimes so strange and so dark that people will still be arguing about them more than 700 years later. How did it come to this? How did a handful of poor knights, who began by guarding dusty roads outside Jerusalem, rise to hold castles, fleets, and treasuries across an entire continent? And how did it all collapse in a single morning? That is the story we're going to walk through tonight. Slowly, gently, with no hurry at all. So settle in and let the centuries drift by. Hey buddy, welcome back. It's good to have you here again. Come on in, get comfortable. Pull the blanket up a little. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Maybe you're in bed already. Maybe you're on the couch with the lights down low. Maybe you're driving home late and just want a quiet voice for company. Wherever you are, you're welcome here. Tonight we have a long one, a really long one. This is the story of the Knights Templar, the rise, the wealth, the power, the fall, and the mystery that came after. We're going to take our time with it. We'll walk through pilgrim roads and desert castles, through candlelit chapter houses and busy medieval harbors. We'll sit at their tables and listen to their bells. And somewhere along the way, if you drift off, that's perfectly fine. That's what this is for. The story will still be here tomorrow. Before we begin, just a couple of small things, and then I'll stop asking anything of you at all. If these long, quiet nights of history help you relax, it would mean a lot if you'd subscribe. It's free, it takes a second, and it tells me you'd like more nights like this one. No pressure at all, just if it feels right. And I always love knowing who's out there in the dark with me. So if you have a moment before you doze off, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Maybe it's just past midnight in Ohio. Maybe it's 3 in the morning in Seattle and the rain is going. Maybe you're listening on a night shift somewhere, keeping watch while everyone else sleeps. I read those comments with my morning coffee, and honestly, it's one of my favorite parts of doing this. All right, that's everything. From here on, it's just you, me, and the past. Take one slow breath, let it out, and now let's go back, way back, past your grandparents, past the founding of this country, past Columbus, past the printing press, back about 900 years to a hot, dusty road in the hills outside Jerusalem. The road to Jerusalem, I want you to imagine a road, not a paved road, not even a gravel road. Just a track of packed earth and loose stone, winding down out of pale limestone hills, in a land where the summer sun is so strong that the light itself seems to have weight. It is the early 1100s, let's say the year 1115 or so, and this is the road from the port city of Jaffa on the Mediterranean coast up to Jerusalem. It's about 40 miles. On foot, in that heat over those hills, it takes 2 or 3 days. And walking that road right now, in the scene I want you to hold in your mind, is a group of pilgrims. Look at them for a moment. There are maybe 30 of them, strung out in a loose line. Most are on foot. A few of the wealthier ones ride donkeys or mules. They are dressed in rough wool and linen, gray and brown and dusty, and nearly every one of them carries the same two things: a walking staff worn smooth by their hands and a small leather bag called a scrip hanging at the hip, holding a bit of bread, a few coins, maybe a letter from a priest back home. Some of them have been traveling for a year, some longer. Think about that for a second. Imagine this for a moment. You leave your village in England or the Rhineland or Norway, and you genuinely know that you may never come home. You've made your will. You've settled your debts. Your neighbors gathered at the church to see you off, and the priest blessed your staff and your bag at the altar. And then you just started walking across France, over the Alps maybe, down through Italy to a port where you paid a ship's captain to pack you into a hold with 100 other pilgrims, everyone seasick, everyone praying for weeks on the water. And now, finally, you are on the last stretch. 2 more days of walking, and you will see Jerusalem with your own eyes. The city you've heard about in church every week of your life. The center of the world, as the maps of your time actually drew it. The air on this road smells of dust and hot stone and the faint resin of scrubby pines. Cicadas buzz in the heat, a sound so constant you stop hearing it. Your feet ache, your lips are cracked. The water in your leather flask is warm and tastes of the goat that the skin came from. And there is one more thing on this road, underneath everything else, and it never quite leaves you: fear, because this road is dangerous. Genuinely, famously dangerous. The land around Jerusalem had been conquered by the armies of the First Crusade about 15 years earlier, in 1099, and we'll talk about that in a bit, but conquering a few cities is not the same as controlling the countryside. Out in these hills there are bandits, there are raiders. There are men who have learned that pilgrims carry coins, and that pilgrims are exhausted and unarmed and far from anyone who would come looking for them. And the attacks were not small things. In one infamous incident around Easter of the year 1119, a large band of pilgrims walking from Jerusalem toward the Jordan River was ambushed. Hundreds of them were killed or carried off. Hundreds. These were not soldiers. These were farmers and shopkeepers and grandmothers who had walked across the known world to pray, and they died in the dust within sight of their destination. News like that traveled. Slowly, the way all news traveled then, by word of mouth, in ports and market squares and monastery guest houses, but it traveled. And everywhere it went, it carried the same uncomfortable question. Someone should be protecting these people. Why is no one protecting these people? Let's pause on that question, because the answer tells you a lot about the world we've just stepped into. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, this new Crusader state, ruled by a French-speaking king in a conquered city, was chronically, desperately short of manpower. Most of the Crusaders who survived the First Crusade simply went home. They had fulfilled their vows, they had seen the holy places, and they had farms and families and lawsuits waiting for them back in Europe. The ones who stayed could barely garrison the cities and castles. There was simply no one left over to patrol 40 miles of bandit country every day of the year, so the roads stayed dangerous, and the pilgrims kept coming anyway. Thousands of them, year after year, walking into those hills with their staffs and their little leather bags, hoping. Hold that image. The heat, the dust, the long line of tired people, the nervous glances at every ridgeline. Because it's out of exactly this, not out of glory, not out of conquest, but out of the very practical, very human problem of people getting robbed on a road, that the Knights Templar are about to be born. But before we meet them, we should take a moment to understand how this strange world came to exist at all. How there came to be a French king in Jerusalem and European pilgrims on that road in the first place. So let's drift back just a little further, about 20 more years, and watch how it all began. How this world was made. The first crusade. The story starts, oddly enough, in a field in France. It is November of the year 1095 in the town of Clermont in central France. The weather is cold. Late autumn, bare trees, breath steaming, the smell of wood smoke drifting from hundreds of chimneys and cook fires. A great church council has been meeting here, and now, at its close, Pope Urban II steps out to address a crowd so large that no building can hold it. So they gather in an open field. Imagine standing in that crowd. You're packed shoulder to shoulder with farmers and knights and monks, everyone in wool cloaks, everyone's feet slowly going numb in the cold mud. Up ahead on a platform, a distant figure begins to speak, and his words are repeated back through the crowd in waves, the way news moved through big gatherings before microphones, one row telling the next. What the Pope says that day, in essence, is this: Christians in the East are in danger. The holy city of Jerusalem is in the hands of others. Stop fighting one another here at home, and God knows the knights of Europe spent most of their time doing exactly that, and go east instead. Take up the cross. And to those who go, the Church offers something extraordinary: the forgiveness of sins. Now, whatever you or I might think about all of this from the distance of 9 centuries, and it is a complicated, painful history, with tragedy on every side, what matters for our story tonight is what it felt like to the people in that field. To a medieval person, sin was not an abstraction. It was a weight. It was a debt you carried, and the interest compounded, and the bill came due after death. And here was the Pope offering a way to pay it all off, not by giving up the sword, which was the only trade a knight knew, but by using it. The response stunned everyone, probably including Urban himself. The crowd began to chant. The chroniclers tell us the cry was Deus vult, God wills it. People tore strips of cloth and sewed crosses onto their shoulders on the spot. And over the following months, tens of thousands of people, knights, yes, but also ordinary people, whole families, the poor, the old, simply got up and started walking east. Most had no real idea how far Jerusalem was. Some, the chronicles say, would come within sight of any large city on the road and ask if that was Jerusalem. It's a detail that has always stayed with me. Imagine walking for weeks, and every time towers appear on the horizon, your heart lifts and you ask, and someone shakes their head. Not yet, not even close. The journey took years. It killed enormous numbers of them: hunger, disease, drowning at river crossings, battle. But in the summer of 1099, against every reasonable expectation, the survivors of that great walk stood before the walls of Jerusalem. And in July of that year, they took the city, in a siege that ended in a massacre of its inhabitants, a horror the Crusaders' own chroniclers recorded, and one we shouldn't look away from, even in a quiet story like this one. History is not a lullaby all the way through. Some of it we simply sit with, acknowledge, and carry forward gently. And then, as I mentioned, most of the Crusaders went home. What they left behind was a thin, improvised patchwork of territories along the eastern Mediterranean coast, the lands Europeans came to call Outremer, which is just French for overseas. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, the county of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, the county of Edessa. Little islands of European rule, dotted along a coastline, surrounded by neighbors who had every reason to want them gone, and populated mostly by people, Muslims, Jews, Eastern Christians, who had never asked for any of this. And into this fragile, improvised, dangerous world came the Pilgrims. Because now that Jerusalem was in Christian hands, everyone wanted to see it. The trickle of pilgrims became a river, and the roads, as we've seen, were not safe. Take a breath here with me. Feel how far we've come already, from a cold field in France to the hot hills of Judea. That's the stage. Those are the conditions. Now at last, let's meet the men this whole night is about. Because in the year 1119, in Jerusalem, a small group of knights is about to have an idea, a strange, humble, completely unprecedented idea, and nobody present could possibly have guessed where it would lead. Let's go meet them. 9 knights and an idea. The year is 1119, and we are in Jerusalem. Let's go inside the city for a moment, because I want you to feel what Jerusalem was like in these years, before we meet our knights. It is early morning. The light comes up gold over the Mount of Olives, and the city's stone, that pale, honey-colored Jerusalem limestone, catches it and holds it. The streets are narrow, many of them stepped, worn slick in places by 2,000 years of feet. In the markets, the vendors are laying out their goods, flatbread still warm from communal ovens, olives glistening in clay bowls, dates, lentils, small salted fish brought up from the coast. There's the smell of baking bread and donkey dung and burning charcoal, all mixed together, the smell of every ancient city that ever was. You hear half a dozen languages before breakfast. French, the language of the new rulers. Arabic, Greek, Armenian, Syriac, Latin from the priests. The city is smaller than you might imagine, and emptier. The massacre of 1099 and the wars have hollowed it out, and the new king has been trying to coax settlers in to fill the empty houses. And rising above everything, on its great platform at the eastern edge of the city, is the Temple Mount, the Haram al-Sharif, with the dome of the rock shining at its center, and near it the great Al-Aqsa Mosque, which the Crusaders, in their confident ignorance, decided was the Temple of Solomon itself. The King of Jerusalem had actually taken the Al-Aqsa building as his royal palace for a while. That detail matters, and in a moment you'll see why. Now, somewhere in this city, in this year 1119, there is a French knight named Hugh de Payens. We know frustratingly little about him, which is often the way with people who change history. The record only starts caring about them after the fact. He was from Champagne in eastern France, likely a middle-ranking knight, a vassal connected to the Count of Champagne. He was probably in his late 40s by now, which in that world made him a genuinely old soldier. He had been in the East for years. And Hugh, along with a small circle of companions, the traditional count is 9 knights, and the names we have include Godfrey de Saint-Omer from Flanders, had been watching what was happening on the roads, the ambushes, the killings. The pilgrims who set out from Jaffa and never arrived, and somewhere in the conversations among these men, an idea took shape that had never quite existed before. Here's why it was strange. In the medieval mind, there were 2 ways to serve God with your whole life, and they pointed in opposite directions. You could become a monk, give up property, marriage, and violence, and spend your days in prayer behind a wall. Or you could remain a knight in the world, fighting, and hope that pilgrimage and penance would balance the books of your soul. Monk and warrior were opposites, oil and water. What Hugh and his companions proposed was to be both at once. They would take the same 3 vows as monks: poverty, chastity, and obedience. They would live in community, pray the daily offices, own nothing individually. But instead of copying manuscripts or tending gardens, their work, their labor offered to God, would be protecting pilgrims on the roads with sword and lance. Imagine this for a moment. Imagine being one of those first 9. You have given away everything. You sleep in a shared dormitory. You eat plain food in silence. And then in the morning, you put on mail armor over your plain wool habit, take up your shield, and ride out into the hills to spend the day escorting a straggling line of exhausted Norwegian pilgrims through bandit country, in the heat, for no pay forever. That's the whole plan. That's the entire founding vision of what would become the most famous military order in history: armed chaperones for tourists living like monks. Around the year 1119 or 1120, the men took their vows before Warmund, the Patriarch of Jerusalem. King Baldwin II, newly on the throne, sharp enough to recognize free help when he saw it, gave them quarters in a wing of that royal palace on the Temple Mount, in the building the Crusaders called the Temple of Solomon. And that is where the name comes from. They called themselves, with typical medieval humility, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. Paupers Camillitones Christi Templique Salomonisai. Over time, people shortened it. The Knights of the Temple, the Templars. In those first years, the poverty was not a slogan. It was the plain truth. The early Templars were genuinely, sometimes embarrassingly poor. They wore donated clothes. They depended on scraps and charity. Their numbers stayed tiny. For nearly a decade, they seem to have attracted very few recruits. There's one image from this period that the order itself chose to preserve forever, and I'd like you to hold it in your mind as we close this section. When the Templars later designed their official seal, the wax stamp that authenticated their documents, they chose a picture of 2 knights riding a single horse. 2 armored men, crowded onto one animal, because in the early days they were too poor for each man to have his own. Now, whether that was ever literally, tactically true, a war horse carrying 2 armored men wouldn't get far, is beside the point. The point is what they wanted the world to remember about them. We began with nothing. We shared everything. We were poor men doing necessary work. Keep that image of the 2 men on one horse somewhere in the back of your mind tonight. Because the distance between that seal and what the Templars would become, the castles, the fleets, the treasure vaults of kings, is the whole arc of this story. But for now, in the early 1120s, they are still just a handful of aging knights in borrowed rooms, patrolling a hot road, praying in the night, and slowly realizing something important. If this idea was ever going to matter, it needed help from home. It needed Europe. It needed money, recruits, and above all, legitimacy. And so, around 1127, Hugh de Payens did something that would change everything. He got on a ship and he went west. Let's follow him. The salesman of God. Hugh goes to Europe. I want you to picture a small sailing ship working its way across the Mediterranean in the late 1120s. Sea travel in this era is nothing like we imagine. The ship is round-bellied, single-masted, or maybe 2, riding low, smelling of tar and bilge water and wet rope. Passengers sleep on deck or packed into the hold among the cargo. The food is ship's biscuit, salted meat, wine going slowly to vinegar. Sailors navigate by coastline and stars and accumulated instinct, hugging the shore when they can, and everyone aboard knows people who have drowned. Somewhere on a ship like this is Hugh de Payens, a man now around 60 years old, sailing toward Europe with a mission: to save his tiny, struggling order. And here is where the story takes its first great turn, because Hugh, whatever else he was, turned out to be remarkably good at this. Or perhaps more accurately, he had remarkably good connections, and he arrived at exactly the right moment. His single most important connection was a monk, arguably the most influential man in Europe at that moment, more influential in practice than kings and possibly than the Pope, Bernard of Clairvaux. Let me tell you a little about Bernard, because you can't understand the Templars' rise without him. Bernard was the abbot of Clairvaux, a Cistercian monastery in Champagne, the same region Hugh came from. These circles all overlapped. He was in his late 30s, thin, chronically ill, ferociously intelligent, and blessed or cursed with a pen and a tongue that could move the entire continent. When Bernard endorsed something, it succeeded. When he condemned something, it withered. Kings wrote to him for advice and got scoldings back and thanked him for them. And Bernard loved the Templar idea, loved it. To him, it solved a problem that had bothered churchmen for centuries. What do you do with knights? Europe was full of armed, trained, violent young men who spent their time feuding, raiding each other's lands and trampling peasants' crops. Here, at last, was a way to take all that violent energy and pour it into a channel the church could bless. Bernard would later write a treatise for the order, in praise of the new knighthood, in which he drew a sharp line between the ordinary knights of Europe, whom he mocked for their vanity, their silk, their jeweled bridles, their long hair, and this new kind of knight, disciplined, plain, crop-haired, dusty, sworn to poverty. He praised the Templars in language so glowing it makes a modern reader a little uneasy. But as advertising, it was priceless. The greatest spiritual celebrity of the age had just written the world's most influential endorsement. The formal breakthrough came in January of 1129 at a church council in the town of Troyes in Champagne. Let's go inside that council for a moment, because it's a lovely scene to rest in. It is deep winter in northern France. Outside, the fields are frozen, the roads iron hard, the river running dark between banks of dirty snow. Inside the cathedral precincts, in a chapter hall warmed barely by braziers, the great men of the church have gathered. Archbishops, bishops, abbots in their heavy vestments, their breath faintly visible even indoors when they move away from the fires. Wax candles burn in iron stands. A clerk sits at a lectern with parchment, quills, and a pot of ink he has to keep warm so it doesn't thicken in the cold. And before this assembly stands Hugh de Payens, a weathered old soldier from the East, telling churchmen about the roads outside Jerusalem, about the pilgrims, about the little community living in the Temple of Solomon, and asking the church to recognize them, to give them a rule. And the council said yes. With Bernard's guiding hand all over the result, the council approved what became known as the Latin Rule of the Templars, dozens of regulations governing every corner of a Templar's life. The order now officially existed in the eyes of the church, and Hugh didn't stop there. He toured. Over the following months, he traveled through France, England, Scotland, Flanders, and everywhere he went, something remarkable happened. Donations poured in. Lords gave land. Ladies gave rents. Ordinary people gave what they had: a field, a mill, a vineyard, a few coins. Recruits signed up. The King of England, Henry I, received Hugh with honor and sent him on with gifts. It's worth pausing here to ask, gently, why? Why did medieval people give so freely to a band of soldier monks fighting a war most donors would never see? Part of it was fashion and Bernard's endorsement. But the deeper reason is the one we touched on in that cold field at Clermont, the medieval economy of the soul. Giving land to the Templars was understood as an investment in your own salvation. The knights would fight in the Holy Land on your behalf, pray for your soul. Their merit would, in some sense, rub off on you. Deathbed gifts were common. A lord who had spent his life doing questionable things could balance the ledger at the end with a generous grant to the temple. Some men asked to be buried in Templar cemeteries or to be admitted to the order in their final days, wearing the mantle as they died. So the gifts came, and they never really stopped. Within a generation, this order of poor knights held property in nearly every region of Western Europe, not because of conquest, because of pilgrims' fear, a monk's pen, and thousands upon thousands of ordinary people quietly signing over fields and mills, hoping for heaven. Hugh de Payens sailed back east with money, men, and a rule. He had left as the leader of a curiosity. He returned as the master of an institution. And now that the order has its rule, I want to do something a little different. I want to slow the story almost to a stop and spend some time on the question I find most fascinating of all, not the battles, not the politics, but this: what was it actually like, day by day, hour by hour, to live as a Templar? Because the rule tells us, in astonishing, homely, human detail, and that's where we're going next. The Pope's gift: how the Templars became untouchable. Before we watch a young man join the order, there's one more piece of the machinery we should look at, because without it, nothing else in this story makes sense. Not the wealth, not the independence, and not, in the end, the resentment. It's a piece of parchment. In the year 1139, Pope Innocent II issued a document in the Templars' favor. Papal documents are known by their opening words, and this one began Omni datum optimum, every good gift. It's a lovely phrase for what turned out to be one of the most consequential legal instruments of the entire Middle Ages. Let me tell you what it did slowly, because each clause is a small door opening onto the order's future. First, it placed the Templars directly under the Pope, not under bishops, not under kings. Under the Pope alone, who was usually 1,000 miles away and busy. In practice, this meant that no local authority, no bishop in whose diocese a commandery sat, no lord on whose border they farmed, could give the Templars orders, discipline them, or demand anything of them. Imagine a company today that answered to no city, no state, no national government, only to a distant international body that heard from it once a year. That was the Temple from 1139 onward. Second, it exempted them from tithes. The tithe was the universal church tax of the Middle Ages, a tenth of your harvest, owed to the local church, as regular as the seasons. The Templars didn't pay it. Better, they were allowed to collect tithes given to them. Every field the order farmed was, in effect, 10% more profitable than the identical field next door. Multiply that by thousands of estates across 2 centuries, and you begin to see how the wealth compounded, quietly, season after season, like interest. Third, they could have their own priests, chaplain brothers answering to the master, not the bishop, and their own chapels and their own cemeteries. This sounds technical. It wasn't. It meant a whole parallel church, a private spiritual economy. People wanted burial in Templar ground the way people today want plots in a famous cemetery, and they paid for it in bequests. And when a district was under interdict, that terrible medieval punishment where a whole region's churches went dark, no mass, no bells, the Templars were permitted once a year to open their doors anyway. Imagine the crowds on those days. Later documents added more: their people and property protected by the most severe church penalties. Anyone who laid violent hands on a brother excommunicated automatically. And popes issued letters commanding bishops to protect Templar alms collectors traveling through their lands, because the order ran, among everything else, a continual fundraising operation, brothers riding circuit with relics and letters of indulgence, gathering coins from villages that would never see Jerusalem. Now pause with me here, one of our little thinking pauses. Every institution that has ever existed has learned this rule. Privilege creates resentment in exact proportion to its size, and the Templars' privileges were enormous. Think about the parish priest watching the Templar farm across the valley pay no tithe, while his own peasants scraped theirs together. Think about the bishop who could not set foot inside the commandery in his own diocese, could not audit it, could not correct it, while its chapel bell called his parishioners and their donations away from his churches. Think about the lord whose runaway tenant was suddenly wearing a Templar cross and beyond his reach. For 200 years, complaints flowed to Rome from bishops, from parish clergy, from councils. William, Archbishop of Tyre, the great historian of the Crusader kingdom, who lived beside the Templars and wrote in the 1180s, admired their origins and then added with an audible sniff that they had grown enormously rich and had withdrawn obedience from the very patriarchs who had helped found them. He is not a neutral witness. No one with a tithe dispute ever is, but he tells us exactly what the educated establishment had come to feel. The word you keep meeting in the sources, decade after decade, is pride. The pride of the temple. Whether the brothers were actually prouder than anyone else in that spectacularly proud age is honestly hard to say. Their surviving letters are mostly about grain shipments and garrison pay, but it didn't matter. The perception settled in early and never left. The Templars answer to no one, and an institution that answers to no one is loved only while it is winning. File that away, buddy, in the same drawer where you're keeping the king with the empty treasury. It will all come back at the end, but that's the far future still. In the middle of the 12th century, where we are now, the privileges simply meant growth, houses multiplying across Europe, recruits arriving, revenues flowing east. And every one of those recruits had to walk through a particular door, kneel on a particular floor, and answer a particular set of questions. Let's watch that happen. Joining the temple, the door, the questions, and the mantle before we live a full day inside a Templar house, I want to show you how a man got in. Because the rule, especially the expanded French version the order used in later years, preserves the reception ceremony almost word for word, and it is one of the most quietly moving documents the Middle Ages left us. It reads less like ritual and more like a very serious, very gentle job interview conducted by candlelight. So imagine this for a moment. It is a Sunday morning in some commandery. Let's put it in Provence, in the south of France in the 1180s. Outside autumn, the vineyards gone gold and rust, mist lying in the low ground, the smell of fallen leaves and wet earth and wood smoke from the kitchen fire. And standing outside the door of the chapter house in his best clothes, which are not very good clothes, is a young man. Let's call him Arnaud. He is perhaps 22. He is the third son of a minor knightly family, which means in the arithmetic of that world that there is no land for him. His eldest brother gets the estate. The second brother is already placed. Arnaud gets a horse, a sword, his father's blessing, and a problem: what to do with the rest of his life. He has thought about this for a year. He has talked to the old Templar who administers the vineyard his family rents from the order. And now he waits outside the chapter door while inside the assembled brothers are asked, as the rule requires, whether anyone knows any reason this man should not be received. Nobody does. The door opens. Now here is the part I find so striking. The ceremony does not begin with glory. It begins with warnings. Arnaud is brought in and made to kneel, and he asks. The words are prescribed for the bread and water and the poor clothing of the house, and for its fellowship. And the presiding brother's answer, straight from the rule, is essentially this: think very hard, friend. You see us from the outside, fine horses, good armor, fine mantles, and you think you will be comfortable here. but you cannot know the harsh commandments that lie beneath. It is a hard thing for you, who are your own master, to make yourself the serf of another. When you wish to sleep, you will be made to wake. When you wish to wake, you will be told to sleep. When you want to be here, you will be sent there, across the sea perhaps, and you will not be asked. They wanted him to flinch. The ceremony is built to give a man every chance to walk away. And if he doesn't flinch, then come the questions, practical, unsentimental, one after another, because the order had learned the hard way what problems walk in through that door wearing best clothes. Are you married or promised to a woman? Because a wife could later claim her husband back, mantle and all, and it had happened. Do you owe debts you cannot pay? Because creditors could come collecting from the order. Have you made vows to another religious order? Are you a priest in hiding? Are you healthy in body, no hidden illness? Are you anyone's serf? And a question that tells you everything about how the order got burned by human nature. Have you given money to anyone in this house to smooth your way in? Because that was simony, the buying of holy things, and men were expelled for it. Each question Arnau answers kneeling, with his hands on the Gospels, and then the promises: obedience to the master, chastity, poverty, to live without property of his own, to keep the good customs of the house, and to help conquer and hold the Holy Land with all the strength God gives him for the rest of his life. And then the mantle, for Arnau, a knight's son, the white one, folded, held ready by the brother chaplain. They stand him up and they place it over his shoulders, and the presiding brother fastens the laces at the throat, and the chaplain says a psalm, and every brother in the room prays. And the officer who received him raises him up and kisses him on the mouth, the formal kiss of peace, the medieval seal on every solemn bond, and just like that, everything Arnau was is gone. His name stays, but nothing else follows him through that door. Whatever he owned belongs to the order now. Where he sleeps, what he eats, where on the map of the known world he wakes up next year, none of it is his to decide ever again. The rule says the new brother should then be taught, gently and at length, the small law of his new life. And the list is wonderful because it is so relentlessly practical: how he must eat and how he must dress, that he must not swear, that he must never be alone with a woman, nor kiss one. The rule says not even his mother or his sister, a hardness that makes you wince a little and should. That if he receives letters, they are read to him by permission, aloud. That he must not boast of his former life. That he must sleep in shirt and breeches and belt, as we've seen. How to ask pardon in chapter when he breaks a rule, because he will break rules. Everyone did, and the weekly chapter meeting doubled as a kind of disciplinary court where brothers confessed faults and took their penance, which might be eating on the floor for a time, or losing the mantle for a year for serious things. The order kept records of these judgments as case law, and reading them now is like reading the personnel files of a very strange, very earnest company. A brother who lost a horse through carelessness, brothers who quarreled, a brother who struck another, a brother who left the house at night without leave and came back shamefaced. 700 years later, you can still hear actual human beings in those entries, with tempers and bad days and regrets. One more thing about who came through that door, because it wasn't only young men like Arnau. Old knights joined, widowed and tired, looking for a harbor. Some men joined at the very end of life, sick men carried in, receiving the mantle on their deathbeds so they could be buried in it. Married couples became associates of the order, confraters donating property while they lived, sharing in the brothers' prayers. And here's a detail that surprises nearly everyone. There were, in at least one documented corner of the Templar world, women. A small community at Rural in Catalonia seems for a time to have lived as sisters under Templar authority, a handful of women in a quiet Spanish house attached to the Great War Machine, praying its offices. History is always messier and more interesting than the legend. And think for a moment, one of our little pauses, how different this is from any commitment we make today. We change jobs, cities, even names. Nearly every door we walk through, we can walk back out of. Are now kneeling on the cold flagstones of that chapter house with the smell of candle wax and autumn damp in the air, is doing something almost extinct in our world, choosing one thing once forever. And whatever we make of it, there is something restful in even imagining a choice that final. One door, one yes, and after that, no more choosing at all. The mantle is on his shoulders now. The brothers file out to Mass, and tomorrow, Arna wakes to the bell like everyone else. So now let's live that day with him, all of it, hour by hour. A day in the life, the rule of the temple. Let's spend a whole day together inside a Templar house. Not a famous day, not a battle day, just an ordinary Tuesday, sometime in the middle of the 12th century in a commandery. That's what their houses were called, somewhere in the kingdom of Jerusalem. It begins in the dark. It is somewhere around 4 in the morning, and a single bell is ringing, not urgently. Just steadily, patiently, the way it rings every single night of every single year. This is the call to matins, the night office. I want you to imagine the dormitory in that moment. A long stone room, rows of simple beds, a straw mattress, a bolster, a blanket, maybe two in winter. And here's a detail straight from the rule that I love. A lamp burns in the dormitory all night, every night. The brothers are never in total darkness. And another detail, homelier still, the rule instructs the brothers to sleep clothed in shirt and breeches with their belts on. A Templar was to be ready always and modest always, so when the bell rings, there's no fumbling for clothes. The men simply sit up, push their feet into their shoes, take up their cloaks against the cold. Listen to the sounds of it, the rustle of straw mattresses, a cough, the scuff of leather soles on stone. Nobody speaks, talking is discouraged through the night hours. The men file down a dark corridor toward the chapel, and the air in the corridor is cold, the deep mineral cold of a stone building at 4 in the morning, and the only light is the small flames of the lamps, throwing long soft shadows that sway as the men pass. In the chapel, wax candles burn at the altar. The brothers take their places, and the chanting begins, psalms, sung slowly in Latin in the plain, unadorned way the order favored. Most of the knights don't read. They aren't scholars, they're soldiers. So the rule accommodates them. Where a literate priest brother recites the full office, the lay brothers repeat a set number of Our Fathers instead. 13 for matins. The prayers of practical men, counted out like a soldier counts paces. And then here's another human touch from the rule. After the night office, before returning to bed, each knight is to go check his horses and his equipment. In the dark, in the cold, a quiet round through the stables. You can picture it, the warm animal smell of the stable after the cold corridor, the horses shifting and breathing in the dark, a hand run along a girth strap, a murmured word to a gelding, and the rule does permit the brothers to speak quietly at need during this round. Then back to bed until dawn. They rise again for prime at first light. More psalms. Then the day unfolds in a rhythm that alternates, hour by hour, between prayer and work. The offices of terce, sext, nun, vespers, compline, marking the day the way a clock face marks hours indeed. For these men, the offices were the clock. What is the work? It depends on who you are, because a Templar house is a little world with many kinds of people in it, and this surprises most folks, so let's linger on it. When you hear Knights Templar, you picture the knight, the white mantle, the red cross, the war horse. But the knights were always a minority in the order, sometimes something like a tenth of the membership. For every knight brother there were several sergeant brothers, men of common birth, who wore black or brown mantles instead of white, fought as lighter cavalry or infantry, and did much of the actual running of things. There were chaplain brothers, priests of the order. And there were craftsmen and farm hands and shepherds and cooks and smiths, some full brothers, some hired hands, some local laborers. Because here is the truth of the Templar Empire, the unglamorous engine under the legend. It was mostly farms. For every brother in the East holding a sword, there were brothers in Europe holding rakes. Hundreds of commanderies across France, England, Spain, Italy, Germany, and most of them were not fortresses at all, but working agricultural estates. A stone house, a chapel, a barn, a dovecote, a mill, orchards, fish ponds, fields of wheat and barley, flocks of sheep. The whole point of these places was to generate income responsions, they called the annual payments, and ship it east to fund the war. A third of revenues sent year after year, decade after decade. So if you had visited a typical Templar house in, say, the English countryside, you would not have found warriors sharpening swords. You would have found something that looked almost exactly like a well-run monastic farm. Brothers in plain habits supervising the shearing, a couple of old knights retired from the east drowsing in the sun, lay servants carting hay, the smell of a bake house, doves murmuring in the cote, and the bell going for none in the early afternoon. Take a moment with that. The largest military order in Christendom, and its daily soundtrack in most places on most days was sheep. But let's come back to our commandery in the East, because it's nearly mealtime, and Templar meals are wonderful to watch. The bell rings and the brothers file into the refectory, the dining hall. Long tables, benches, plain white cloths. Each man has his cup and his spoon, knives they carry themselves, and they eat in silence. Total silence apart from one voice, a reader standing at a lectern, reading aloud from scripture or the lives of saints while the brothers eat. If you need the salt, you don't ask for it, you gesture. The rule and later customs describe this little sign language of the table, hands asking quietly for bread, for water, for the dish to be passed, and the food better than you'd guess. This is one of my favorite corners of the whole subject. Monks of the strict orders ate no meat, or almost none. But the Templar rule takes a different view, and it says so in almost apologetic terms. Because the brothers must be strong enough to fight, they shall eat meat, typically 3 days a week. Beef, mutton, pork. On other days, vegetable pottages, eggs, cheese, fish. Wine with meals in measured rations, watered. The rule frets gently about wine, as every institution housing soldiers always has. And there's a lovely provision about the bowls. The brothers ate 2 by 2 from shared dishes, each pair splitting a bowl, and the rule says each should watch that his companion gets his fair share and quietly make sure the other man takes enough. 2 men to a bowl, like 2 men to a horse. The whole ethos of the order in a piece of tableware. Portions of every meal were set aside for the poor. 1/10 of the bread given as alms plus the leftovers. Every Templar house was, among other things, a soup kitchen. That detail rarely makes it into the movies. The afternoon passes in work and training. For the fighting brothers in the East, that means horses and weapons, riding at the quinton, a pivoting target on a post, practicing formation maneuvers, because disciplined group charges were the Templars' great tactical weapon in a world of glory-hunting individualists. It means maintaining equipment. Mail to be scoured of rust, you'd roll it in a barrel of sand, leather to be oiled, blades to be honed. The armory smells of oil and sand and old sweat-soaked leather padding. As evening comes, vespers, supper lighter than dinner, then Compline, the last office, and a shared drink of watered wine, and then the great silence settles over the house for the night. The rule is firm on this. After Compline, no speaking except at genuine need and softly. Picture the commandery settling. Lamps put out one by one, except the ones that burn all night. The gatekeeper making his last round, the heavy beam sliding home across the gate, horses shifting in the stable, sentries on the wall watching the stars wheel over the hills, and rows of men lying clothed and belted on straw mattresses under one small flame, resting until the bell calls them at 4 in the morning to stand and pray in the cold again. That was the life, not most days, every day, for the rest of your life. Think about how different that is from anything we know. No weekends. No retirement in the modern sense. No personal money. A brother found with private coins at his death could be denied burial in consecrated ground. No family. Your letters could be read. You couldn't even leave the house without permission or ride out alone. And yet men lined up to join. Thousands of them for 200 years. Some for faith, some for structure, some for 3 meals and a bed, some fleeing grief or debt or a life that had gone wrong. The rule and the order's court records show they took in a very wide range of humanity. It was a hard life, but it was a clear one. Every hour accounted for, every question answered. In a chaotic and frightening world, there must have been real peace in that bell. Rest with that thought a moment. The strange peace of a life where nothing is yours and nothing is uncertain. And while thousands of brothers were living exactly this quiet agricultural rhythm across Europe, their order was becoming something else entirely on the world stage. Because out in the East, the wars were getting bigger, and the Templars, disciplined, funded, permanent, were becoming the professional core of every Crusader army. It's time to talk about the fighting, gently but truthfully. White mantles in the dust, the Templars at war before we watch them fight. Let's dress a Templar knight properly, piece by piece, because getting dressed for war in the 12th century was a project. Imagine a knight brother preparing for a campaign in the gray hour before dawn with a sergeant or a squire helping him. He starts with ordinary clothes, linen shirt, breeches, wool hose. Then comes a padded garment, quilted layers of cloth, thick as a winter comforter, that will cushion the blows. Over that, the mail hauberk, thousands upon thousands of interlinked iron rings, riveted one by some armor years ago, hanging to his knees with a hood of mail, a coif for his head and neck. A full hauberk weighs perhaps 25 or 30 pounds, and it goes on over the head in a rushing slither of cold metal that every knight knew intimately, the sound of it, the smell of it, iron and oil and old sweat. Mail leggings on the legs. A steel helmet in the early days, an open-faced cone with a nasal bar. By the 13th century, often the great helm, a steel bucket enclosing the whole head with slits to see through. And then over the armor, the garment that made a Templar, the white surcoat and mantle with the red cross. White for purity, granted to the knights early on, the red cross added around the time of the Second Crusade, a sign of martyrdom. Sergeants, remember, wore black or brown. Sword at the belt, a straight, double-edged arming sword, lighter than people imagine, around 3 pounds, quick in the hand, a shield on the arm, a lance, and under him the great investment of the whole enterprise, the war horse. The rule allowed a knight 3 horses, and the destrier, the war horse, was worth more than most farms. It was fed, groomed, and guarded like the strategic asset it was. Those stable checks after the knight office weren't piety. They were readiness. Now, how did these men actually fight? What made them different? One word: discipline. And in the 12th century, on a battlefield of proud individual knights each hunting personal glory, discipline was close to a superpower. The rule laid it out with a clarity you can still feel today. On the march, brothers rode in fixed order, in silence, each with his place. In camp, no brother left the lines without permission. and in battle the iron law. No Templar was to charge, break ranks, or leave the formation without the marshal's order. The squadron moved as one body behind the order's banner, a simple flag, black over white, called the piebald banner. As long as that banner flew, no brother could leave the field. If it fell, he was to rally to any other Christian banner still flying. Only when no banner remained standing was he free to save himself. And there was a further vow, quietly extraordinary. Templars did not surrender while the banner flew, and the order, as a matter of policy, paid no ransom for captured brothers. Every enemy they faced knew this. A captured Templar was worth nothing in money and everything in symbolism, and after some battles the captured knights were executed rather than ransomed. The brothers knew that, too, when they lined up behind the banner. The result was a unit that functioned, frankly, like a modern professional force embedded in a medieval world. They held formation under fire from horse archers. They charged on command and only on command, and they served as vanguard or rearguard, the positions of greatest danger, in nearly every major crusading army for 2 centuries. Kings who could not command their own quarrelsome barons could rely on the temple. Let me give you one scene, one battle to hold, and then we'll step back from the noise, because this is a sleepy story and battles are only a part of it. It is late November, 1177. The place is called Montjesard, in the rolling country northwest of Jerusalem. The great Saladin, and we'll speak more of him soon, has invaded the kingdom with a large army, so confident that he has allowed his forces to spread out and raid. Facing him is a scraped-together Christian force led by a king who is 16 years old and gravely ill with leprosy, Baldwin IV, the leper king. With him, among others, are a modest force of knights of the realm and a contingent of Templars from Gaza, some 80 knights of the order. Imagine the moment before the charge, if you can bear the tension gently. Late autumn light, low and golden. The Christian force appears where it has no business being, catching Saladin's scattered army at a stream crossing. The young king, too weak to fight with his hands, is helped down from his horse before the true cross relic and prays on his knees in front of the army. Then the lines form. The Templar squadron gathers itself, knee to knee, the piebald banner up, the horses stamping and blowing in the cold air. And then the order comes, and 80 knights, and the knights of the realm around them, come down that slope like a hammer, and Saladin's surprised, disordered army breaks. It was a rout. Saladin himself barely escaped, racing for Egypt on a swift camel with the remnant of his guard. It was one of the most stunning victories of the entire crusading era, won by a sick teenager and a few hundred disciplined men. That was the Templars at their best, the sharp, reliable edge of a fragile kingdom. But let's be honest with the ledger, because this story doesn't stay golden. The same qualities that made them formidable, certainty, zeal, esprit de corps, could curdle into arrogance and recklessness. 10 years after Montjesard, at a place called the Springs of Cresson, a Templar master named Gerard de Riedfort would lead about 140 knights in a charge against thousands of enemy cavalry, against all advice, and nearly all of them died. And that was only the prologue to the catastrophe that followed that same summer, a catastrophe we're coming to soon, at a hill with 2 peaks called the Horns of Hattin. For now, though, let's leave the battlefield, wipe the dust off, because during these same decades, back in the cities and the counting houses, the Templars were quietly building something with no swords in it at all, the thing that would make them rich beyond any monastic order in history, and the thing, in the end, that would help kill them. Let's talk about the money. The bankers in white. How the Templars got rich. Here's a question to turn over drowsily in your mind. How do you carry money across a continent in a world with no banks, no checks, no wire transfers, and no police? Say you're a knight in London in the year 1200 and you've taken the cross. The journey to the Holy Land will take months and cost a fortune: your passage, your horses, your equipment, food, lodging, losses. You'll need money at every stage. But if you carry it, a chest of silver pennies on a pack horse, you are, very simply, a robbery waiting to happen. Every road in Europe knows what a crusader's baggage train is worth. The Templars solved this problem, and the solution made them indispensable. It worked like this. You walk into the new temple in London, their great compound down by the Thames. The round church they built there is still standing today, tucked among the law offices, and lawyers walk past it every morning with their coffee. You deposit your silver with the treasurer. You receive a document, a letter of credit, sealed with the order's seal, and then you travel light. In Paris, at the temple's great fortress compound, you present your letter and draw out funds. In the ports of the south again. And when you finally step ashore in Acre on the coast of the Holy Land, you walk into the Templar house there and draw the balance from silver that never crossed the sea with you at all. The money moved on paper. The trust moved on the order's reputation. Think about what made this possible. The Templars had houses everywhere. They kept meticulous records. They were disciplined and audited. They were protected by the church's most severe penalties. Robbing them meant excommunication, and their compounds were literal fortresses. They were, without ever quite planning it, the perfect bank. And so the services multiplied the way services do. Safe deposit. Kings and nobles began storing their treasure, even crown jewels, in Templar vaults. For a while, a good part of the English crown jewels sat in the Paris temple as loan collateral. Trusts and escrow. Two feuding lords could deposit a disputed sum with the temple until a judgment came. Estates. Crusaders leaving for the East handed the temple power over their lands and the care of their families' interests until they returned, or didn't. And then the biggest client of all walked in, the French crown. From the mid-1100s and formally for long stretches of the 1200s, the royal treasury of France was physically kept at the Paris temple, and Templar treasurers effectively served as the kingdom's financial administrators, receiving revenues, making payments, keeping the books for the King of France himself. Popes used them too, moving crusade taxes across Europe through Templar channels. Imagine that for a moment. An order founded to walk beside pilgrims on a dusty road is now, 3 generations later, running the finances of the most powerful kingdom in Western Europe. Let's go inside the Paris temple because it deserves a scene of its own. Picture a walled enclosure on the northern edge of Paris, walls, gates, and rising over everything a massive keep, the Temple Tower with corner turrets, one of the strongest buildings in the city. Inside the enclosure, a church, dormitories, stables, gardens, workshops, a self-contained town. And in the treasury rooms, the daily music of medieval finance, the click and slide of counters on checkered counting cloths. That's actually where the English word exchequer comes from, the checkered cloth they counted on, the scratch of quills keeping the registers, the clink of coin being weighed, because in this world you weighed coins rather than trusting their faces. The heavy iron-bound chests with their multiple locks, where a chest might need 3 keys held by 3 different officers to open. Candlelight on parchment, the smell of ink, wax, cold stone, and money. Now a gentle correction to the legend while we're here in the vault. The Templars were rich, yes, but their wealth was mostly land, not gold. Farms, mills, vineyards, rents, whole villages, urban property in every major city. Income, not hoard, and their expenses were staggering. Castles in the East devoured money. garrisons devoured money. Every lost battle meant horses and equipment replaced by the hundred. The order ran, in effect, a permanent war on a subscription model, and there were years when the temple itself borrowed. Keep that in mind for later when we come to the treasure legends. The famous lost Templar treasure was, for the most part, never a mountain of gold in a cellar. It was sheep in Yorkshire and vineyards in Provence and rents in Paris, wealth you cannot load onto a wagon and spirit away into the night. But try telling that to a king who is drowning in debt, standing in the courtyard of the Paris temple, looking up at that tower and imagining what's inside. Hold that image, we'll meet that king soon enough. First, though, we owe the East a return visit, because while the counting houses hummed, the kingdom the Templars existed to defend was heading toward the worst day in its history, and the Templars would be right at the center of it. Let's go back to the desert one more time. The Horns of Hattin. Every long story has a hinge, a day when everything that comes after is different from everything that came before. For the Crusader kingdoms and for the Templars, that day came on the 4th of July, in the year 1187, on a dry plateau in Galilee, beside an extinct volcano with two rocky peaks that people called the Horns of Hattin. But let's come at it slowly, the way the army did. First, you should meet the man on the other side, because he is one of the great figures of the age, and he deserves better than to be a shadow in this story. His name was Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub. The West called him Saladin. He was a Kurdish officer who had risen to rule Egypt, then Syria, uniting under one command the lands that had surrounded the Crusader states in a great crescent. He was pious, patient, generous to a degree that his own treasurers despaired over. He gave away wealth nearly as fast as it came in, and he had spent years methodically preparing for one great push to take Jerusalem back. Even his enemies, in their own chronicles, kept catching themselves admiring him. That's rare and worth noticing. On the Crusader side, the picture was almost the opposite of unity. The leper king, Baldwin IV, the sick boy who won at Montgisard, had died young, as everyone knew he would. The crown had passed, through a tangle of marriages and factions, to a man named Guy of Lusignan, whom half his own barons didn't respect. And whispering in Guy's ear was that Templar master I mentioned earlier, Gerard de Riedefort, a man of personal grudges and reckless certainty, the survivor of that doomed charge at Cresson. In the summer of 1187, Saladin invaded and besieged the town of Tiberias on the Sea of Galilee. It was bait, and everyone knew it was bait. The Crusader army, the largest the kingdom had ever assembled, roughly 20,000 men, stripped from every garrison, including a large contingent of Templars and Hospitallers, gathered at a well-watered spring at Sepphoris. And there they faced the choice: stay by the water and let Saladin come to them, or march to relieve Tiberias, a full day's march in July in Galilee across a plateau with essentially no water. The council of war argued into the night. The wiser heads, including, to his credit, the lord whose own wife was besieged in Tiberias, said, "Stay. Let the land fight for us." But late that night, Gerard de Riedefort went to the king's tent alone, and by morning the order was given: the army would march. Now I want you to walk with that army for a while, because the tragedy of Hattin isn't really the battle, it's the march. It is the 3rd of July. The sun comes up like a furnace door opening. The army moves in 3 divisions across the plateau: vanguard, center with the relic of the true cross carried in its golden case, rearguard of Templars. The dust rises from thousands of hooves and feet and hangs in the air with no wind to move it, coating throats, whitening beards, gritting between teeth. The heat builds hour by hour. Mail becomes an oven you wear. and from every side all day long, Saladin's mounted archers wheel in, loose their arrows and wheel away, never closing, never committing, just stinging and stinging, forcing the rearguard to halt and turn again and again while the column stretches and frays. And there is no water. That's the whole story of the day. Men had a swallow left in their skins by noon, nothing by afternoon. The horses began to fail. Somewhere ahead lay the springs of the village of Hatton, below the two-horned hill and the lake beyond it. The men could see the Sea of Galilee shining in the distance, an entire lake of fresh water, close enough to torment them, too far to reach. As evening fell, the army, exhausted, maddened by thirst, its rearguard under constant attack, stopped for the night on the waterless plateau, within sight of water. And in the night, Saladin's men set fire to the dry summer grass upwind, so that smoke rolled over the Crusader camp through the darkness, thickening thirst into agony. All night the Muslim army sang and prayed and beat drums around them in a great ring. Saladin brought up camel trains carrying water in goatskins for his own men. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he was in no hurry at all. I'll keep the 4th of July brief, because you and I are here to rest, not to suffer. In the morning, ringed by fire and smoke and arrows, the army tried to fight its way toward the springs. The infantry, past obedience, broke and crowded up one of the horns of the hill, beyond commanding. The knights, including the Templars, charged again and again, and some of those charges came within yards of reaching Saladin himself. His own son later described how his father turned pale as the Frankish knights came on. But there is a limit to what men and horses without water can do. By afternoon, the royal tent had fallen, the true cross was taken, and the king of Jerusalem sat on the ground among his captains, too spent to stand. Nearly the entire fighting strength of the kingdom was killed or captured in a single day. And then came the moment that tells you what the Templars had come to mean. Saladin ransomed or spared most of the ordinary captives of rank. But for the captured brothers of the two military orders, some 200 Templars and Hospitallers, he made an exception. These men, he judged, were too dangerous ever to release. They took no ransom, they would only return to the war. The captured brothers were executed. The chronicles say they went to it without pleading, some prisoners reportedly claiming a Templar mantle they did not own so as to die with the order. Whatever one makes of that account, it tells you what contemporaries believed about these men. Gerard de Riedfort, the master whose counsel had led them all onto that plateau, he notably was kept alive, a bargaining piece. Within months, city after city surrendered, emptied of defenders. And in October of 1187, Saladin took Jerusalem itself, and here history offers one of its quiet lessons in contrast. Where the Crusaders in 1099 had taken the city in a massacre, Saladin took it by negotiated surrender, ransomed much of the population inexpensively, freed many of the poor outright, and left the Church of the Holy Sepulchre standing and open. The city the Templars had been named for, the Temple Mount where the whole story began, the Al-Aqsa building that had housed those first 9 knights, returned to Muslim hands, and the Golden Dome was restored to its place in Muslim devotion. The order had lost its home, its purpose's very address. It would spend the next 100 years based first at Acre on the coast, fighting to get back what was lost. Take a slow breath. Let the smoke of Hatton drift away. Because what comes next, oddly enough, is not decline. It's a strange, brilliant sunset century, the 13th, in which the Templars grow richer and more powerful than ever, build the greatest castles of the age, and hold a shrinking coastline against the tide. Let's spend some quiet time there in the world of the great castles. It's one of the most atmospheric places this story ever visits. The Sunset Century, castles on the coast. Let me take you to a castle by the sea. It's called Chateau Pellerin, Castle Pilgrim, at a place called Atlet on the coast south of Haifa. The Templars built it starting in 1218 with the help of pilgrim laborers, which is how it got its name, and it may have been the strongest fortress in the world at the time it was built. Let's go inside. Imagine approaching from the land, a narrow, sandy peninsula pushing out into the Mediterranean, so the sea wraps around three sides of the castle like a moat the size of the horizon. Across the neck of the peninsula, the Templars raised not one wall but two, the inner one towering over the outer, so that defenders on both walls could shoot at once, with great rectangular towers of cut stone, some blocks so large it took teams of oxen to move them. While they dug the foundations, the story goes, the builders uncovered fresh water springs and a hoard of ancient coins, the castle paying for itself as it rose from the sand. Inside the walls there was everything: vaulted halls, a chapel, stables, storerooms cut deep and cool, cisterns, ovens, a little protected harbor where ships could tie up and resupply the garrison no matter what army sat outside. That was the beauty of the sea castles. As long as Christian ships ruled the water, a place like Atlet could not truly be starved. It was besieged and never fell. In the end, decades later, it would simply be evacuated, abandoned without conquest, the garrison sailing away, the last crusader toehold on the mainland of the Holy Land. Now imagine an evening there, sometime in the middle of the 1200s, in the long peace between storms. The sun is going down over the Mediterranean, and the whole western sky is the color of apricots. The sea sound never stops here. You'd live your whole garrison life inside it, waves folding over on the rocks below the walls, gulls crying and settling. On the walls, the watch is changing. You hear the particular scrape and ring of a spear butt on stone steps and low voices, because the rule's discouragement of idle chatter holds even up here. Down in the courtyard, smoke rises from the kitchen. Tonight is a meat day, and there's mutton in the pots, and the smell of it drifts along the wall walk and makes the sentries' stomachs growl. The horses are being watered in the dusk. Somewhere a chaplain brother is lighting the lamps in the chapel for vespers, and when the bell rings, it rings out over the water, and fishermen out in their boats hear it and cross themselves and keep fishing. 100 men, maybe, live in this place at the edge of the world. Brothers, sergeants, hired crossbowmen, grooms, cooks, held together by a bell, a rule, and a purpose that is slowly, quietly failing. Because that's the truth of the 13th century, and everyone in it half knew. The tide was going out. Crusade after crusade was launched from Europe. Some never arrived, one was diverted, and to the lasting shame of everyone involved, sacked Christian Constantinople instead. King Louis IX of France, the sainted king, led a great crusade into Egypt in 1249 and 1250. It ended with the king himself taken prisoner, and a detail that shows you exactly where real power had come to sit. Part of his enormous ransom was raised on the spot by an officer more or less strong-arming the Templar treasury aboard their ships, the Templars protesting about their duty to their depositors even as the silver was counted out. Even in catastrophe, they were the bank, and a new power was rising in Egypt. The Mamluks, soldier slaves turned sultans, harder and more relentless than anything the Crusaders had faced. Under sultans like Baybars, the great castles began to fall, one by one, like lamps going out along a coast at night. Safed, Beaufort. In 1271, mighty Crac des Chevaliers itself, the Hospitallers' great castle, sister to the Templar strongholds, taken. Each time a castle fell, the map of Outremer shrank a little more, until what remained was, in essence, a string of fortified port cities along the sea, of which the greatest was Acre. We're going to Acre next, for the end. But before we do, let's take one of our little breathers. You and I think about what it must have been like to be a young brother arriving from Europe in, say, 1280. You've grown up hearing the great stories, Jerusalem, Montjesard, the White Mantles. You've said goodbye to everything, taken your vows in some quiet commandery chapel among the sheep pastures, and sailed east at last to join the real war. And what you find is a garrison world, magnificent, disciplined, wealthy, and shrinking. The older brothers don't talk about taking Jerusalem back anymore, not seriously. The letters the masters send to Europe, and we still have some of them, read year after year like weather reports before a storm. Send men, send money. The situation is worse than anyone at home believes. There's a particular kind of quiet in institutions like that, institutions that are still strong but no longer believe their own future. The bell still rings at 4 in the morning. The offices are still sung. The horses are still checked. The walls still manned. The accounts still balanced to the penny. Everyone does their duty beautifully, and underneath it all, everyone is waiting. In the spring of 1291, the waiting ended. The fall of Acre in 1291 was one of the most remarkable cities in the world. Let's walk through it one last time while it's still whole. It sits on a hook of land curling into the Mediterranean, double-walled on the landward side, towers all along the circuit. Inside, it's a dense, thriving, impossibly cosmopolitan port, the last great city of Outremer, and for 100 years since Jerusalem fell, its true capital. The harbor is packed with round-bellied merchant ships from Venice, Genoa, Pisa. The warehouses smell of pepper and cinnamon and raw silk, because Acre is where the caravans of the East meet the ships of the West, and fortunes change hands here every day the sea is open. The city is a patchwork of little worlds. The Venetians have their own quarter, walls and church and bakehouse. The Genoese theirs, the Pisans theirs, and they've fought actual private wars against one another inside the city, which tells you something about how Outremer spent its final decades. The Hospitallers have their compound, the Teutonic Knights theirs. And down at the southwestern tip, where the city meets the open sea, stands the Templar quarter, their strongest fortress in the city, a great keep with walls the chronicles describe as fantastically thick, its gate towers topped with 4 gilded lions, looking out over the water. Listen to the city on an ordinary evening. Church bells, dozens of them, from dozens of churches, competing across the rooftops. The cries of porters in the harbor, hammering from the shipwrights. A babble of Italian and French and Arabic and Greek in the market lanes, and under it all always the sea. In the spring of 1291, the Mamluk Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil arrived before those landward walls with an army the sources describe in numbers that hardly matter beyond the word overwhelming, and with siege engines on a scale no one had seen, great stone-throwing machines with names. One was called the Victorious, another the Furious. They had been dragged from as far as the mountains of Syria and Lebanon, some so large their timbers took 100 carts to carry. The siege lasted about 6 weeks. The machines pounded day and night. The defenders on the walls learned the rhythm of each engine, the groan and thump and the whistle of the stone and the shock through the masonry underfoot. Mines crept under the towers. One by one, the great landward towers were shaken, cracked, and abandoned. The defenders, perhaps 1,000 knights and a dozen odd thousand foot, facing a besieging force many times that held on with a courage that even the Mamluk chroniclers noted. The Templar master himself, an old man named Guillaume de Beaujeu, who had spent his mastership writing those unheeded whether report letters to Europe, led the counterattacks. On the 18th of May, when the final assault broke into the city at dawn through the ruined accursed tower, Beaujeu ran toward the breach half-armored, without waiting to fasten every buckle. In the fighting, he was struck under the raised left arm, where the armor gapped. The men around him saw him turning away and cried out to him not to leave, and he answered, and this is one of those sentences that comes down the centuries plain and human and unbearable. Seigneurs, je ne puis plus, car je suis mort. My lords, I can do no more, I am dead. Look, the blow. And they carried him out of the press, and he died that evening, and they buried him inside the temple compound while the city fell around it. The city collapsed into the harbor. Thousands crowded the quays for ships that were too few, and the last place still holding, the very last, was the Templar fortress at the water's edge. For about 10 more days, packed with fighting brothers and with refugees, it held. A surrender was negotiated, then broke down in violence. The fighting resumed. And in the end, the 28th of May, 1291, the Mamluk miners had so hollowed the foundations that when the final assault crowded onto and into the great tower, the whole structure gave way at last, and it came down, as the chronicles tell it, on defenders and attackers together, a mountain of masonry subsiding into dust and smoke beside the sea. That collapsing tower is as good a symbol as history ever writes on its own. Acre was gone. Within weeks, the remaining coastal holdings were evacuated, including that August Château Pèlerin, our castle of the apricot sunsets, abandoned without a siege, the garrison sailing away to Cyprus, the bells silent, the gates left to the wind and the gulls. 200 years of Outremer were over. The Holy Land was lost. Now here is the question that hung in the air of every court and cloister in Europe, and I want you to feel its weight, because everything that follows flows from it. What now were the Templars for? An order founded to protect pilgrims on the Jerusalem road, and there was no more Jerusalem road. An order whose whole vast machine of farms and banks and fleets existed to pump men and silver into a war, and the war was lost. The Hospitallers, their great rivals, had a second identity to fall back on. They ran hospitals, and within a generation they would conquer roads and reinvent themselves as a naval power. The Teutonic Knights had already pivoted to the Baltic. But the Templars were only ever the war in the east. They withdrew to Cyprus, kept planning the great crusade of reconquest that Europe kept not launching, and waited for a purpose. Rich, privileged, answerable to no king, everywhere. And suddenly, without a job that anyone could see. In the quiet after Acre, in counting houses and council chambers, less friendly eyes began to look at the temple, at the exemptions from taxes, at the vast lands, at the arrogance, real or imagined, of an order that bowed only to a distant pope. Old jokes, he drinks like a Templar, began to carry a colder edge. Pamphleteers and theorists proposed merging the military orders into one, and some proposed that kings, not popes, should lead it. And in Paris, in the strongest kingdom in Europe, there was a king with empty coffers, iron nerves, and lawyers. Let's meet him properly. His name was Philip IV, and people called him Philip the Fair Le Bel for his face, not his conduct. The Iron King Philip IV of France is one of history's genuinely unsettling figures, and contemporaries found him so too. He was tall, handsome, hence the nickname, and almost eerily silent. A bishop who knew him famously said the king was not a man, nor a beast, but a statue. He stared at people and said little, ruled through a circle of brilliant, ruthless lawyer ministers of common birth, men like Guillaume de Nogaret, whom we'll meet again, and believed with complete sincerity, as far as anyone can tell, in two things at once: his own piety and the absolute supremacy of the French crown over everything and everyone inside France. He seems to have seen no contradiction. Men like that rarely do, and Philip needed money the way a fire needs wood. He had inherited wars with England, with Flanders, and wars in this new age were fought with paid soldiers, not feudal levies. His reign was one long financial emergency, and his solutions form a pattern it's worth laying out plainly, because once you see the pattern, October 1307 stops being mysterious. He debased the coinage, melted the good money, and reissued it with less silver, again and again, until riots broke out in Paris, and the king, for a time, had to shelter from an angry mob inside, of all places, the Paris Temple as the Templars guessed. Remember that detail. He taxed the clergy without papal permission, which set off a spectacular collision with the Pope of the day, Boniface VIII. When that pope threatened him, Philip's minister Nagaret led an armed party into Italy in 1303 and physically seized the old pope at his palace at Anagni. The shock of it killed Boniface within weeks. In 1306, Philip arrested the Jews of France en masse, expelled them, and confiscated their property and the debts owed to them. He squeezed the Lombard bankers the same way. So by 1306, the pattern is complete and visible. When this king ran out of money, he found a wealthy, vulnerable group. He moved suddenly, with arrests and seizures prepared in secret, and he wrapped the whole operation in the language of piety and justice, backed by confessions his officials were very skilled at producing. And there sat the temple, the richest ecclesiastical institution in his kingdom, exempt from his taxes, guarding, indeed literally operating, his own treasury, answerable only to a papacy he had just spent a decade humiliating. The order had perhaps a few thousand members in France, most of them by now middle-aged farm administrators and old veterans, not an army. It had wealth, privileges, and no protector. One more piece and the stage is set. In 1305, a new pope had been elected, a Frenchman, Clement V, who never even went to Rome. Sickly, cautious, and elected under heavy French influence, he settled his court eventually at Avignon on France's doorstep within the king's long shadow. And there was one more man in the story now. In Cyprus, the Templars had elected their 23rd Grand Master, Jacques de Molay. An old brother from Burgundy, he joined the order back in 1265, when Acre still stood brave, stubborn, devout, and it must gently be said, not equipped for the game he was about to be forced to play. He was a soldier and administrator of the old school, a man of the rule and the stables and the convoy schedules, about to walk into a chessboard run by Nagaret. In 1306 and 1307, the Pope summoned de Molay to France to discuss two things: plans for a new crusade and a proposal to merge the Templars and Hospitallers into a single order, an idea de Molay opposed in a written memorandum, respectfully but firmly. The old master crossed the sea and traveled to Paris and was received with honor. Rumors about the order, strange stories, said to originate with expelled brothers and paid informers, whispers of secret rites had begun to circulate, and de Molay himself, confident in his order's innocence, actually asked the Pope to open an inquiry and clear the temple's name. The Pope, in August 1307, wrote to the king that he was, reluctantly, going to look into it. Philip did not wait for the Pope's inquiry. On the 13th of October, 1307, a Friday as it happens, and yes, that Friday the 13th connection is a real fact about a real date, whatever one makes of the later superstition, The king's plan, sealed in secret orders sent out weeks earlier to his officials across France, went off like a single sprung trap. We began this whole night with a sleeping brother in the dark before that dawn. Now you know everything that stands behind that moment. Let's return to it, and this time, let's watch what happens. Friday the 13th, the orders had gone out under seal in mid-September, nearly a month ahead, to the king's seneschals and bailies, his provincial officers, all across France. Do not open until the appointed time. When the seals were finally broken in town after town by candlelight, the officials found instructions of astonishing scope. On the same morning, everywhere at once, arrest every brother of the Order of the Temple, seize every house, inventory every possession, and hold the men for the inquisitors. The preamble the king's lawyers had drafted was a masterpiece of horror, a bitter thing, a lamentable thing, a thing horrible to contemplate, accusing the order of denying Christ, of spitting on the cross in secret initiations, of obscene kisses, of idol worship. Whether the men reading it believed a word they obeyed, one did write privately that he could not believe it. He carried out his orders anyway. People generally do. And the thing about the arrest of the Templars, the thing that made it possible at all, is how quiet it was. There was no battle, there was no last stand. Across the whole of France that morning, at farmhouse commanderies and city compounds, elderly knights and sergeant farmers and chaplains, many of them men in their 50s and 60s, shepherds of sheep and keepers of accounts, opened their gates to the king's men, because the king's men had always been more or less friends. Something like 15,000 people were swept up if you count servants and laborers. Of actual professed brothers in France, the number was well over 2,000, and among all of them, the fighting men were a small minority. A famous handful, a couple dozen at most that the records show, escaped, some reportedly shaving their beards and slipping away. Nearly everyone else simply submitted, protesting their innocence, assuming, you can almost hear them assuming, that this was a terrible misunderstanding that the Pope would sort out within weeks. The Grand Master himself, Jacques de Molay, was arrested in Paris at dawn in the Temple, the same fortress where the king's own treasury sat. Just the day before, the 12th of October, de Molay had stood in a place of honor at a royal funeral, holding a cord of the pall, steps from the king. That is how completely the trap held its shape until it sprang. Now, buddy, we come to a hard stretch of the story, and I'll tell it the way I think it should be told at this hour, plainly, briefly, and without lingering. The confessions that followed were produced by torture, the strupado, the rack fire. Those are the facts, and the men's later statements describe them, and under such handling, within weeks, a large majority of the brothers in the king's prisons, including old de Molay himself, confessed to some version of the charges, that at initiation they had been made to deny Christ and spit toward the cross. De Molay confessed in late October before an assembly at the University of Paris. The confession was copied and publicized with tremendous speed, because the confession, of course, was the entire point. Philip's lawyers understood something quite modern. The battle was for public opinion, and a confessed Grand Master was worth more than any treasure in the vaults. And what did the men themselves say when the torture stopped and they could speak freely? Many recanted at the first opportunity, and here the story produces one of its strangest, saddest legal machines. Under inquisitorial law, a heretic who confessed and repented could be reconciled, but a heretic who confessed and then took back his confession was a relapsed heretic, and relapsed heretics were handed to the fire. So the brothers faced a door with two labels, stick to a false confession and live disgraced in prison, or tell the truth, recant, and burn. In May of 1310, 54 Templars who had dared to recant and mount a defense of the order were taken to a field outside Paris near the convent of Saint Antoine and burned in a single day. Witnesses recorded that they maintained the order's innocence to the last, calling out through the smoke, and that this, rather than frightening the rest, hardened many. But it broke the organized defense. The order never got its day in open court after that. The Pope Clement, for his part, wavered back and forth in a way that historians have traced through his letters, genuinely angry at the king's usurpation of a church matter, then buckling, suspending the inquisitors, then restoring them. And in 1308 the king marched de Maillet and a curated group of brothers to meet him, and the confessions were repeated, and the process ground on. In 2001, a researcher working in the Vatican secret archives, Barbara Frail, brought to light a misfiled document now known as the Chinon Parchment, which records that in August 1308 the Pope's own commissioners heard de Maillet and the other leaders, and absolved them of heresy, reconciling them to the Church while leaving them in prison and leaving the order's fate to a council. Which tells you as clearly as anything can what the Pope privately concluded: not heretics, but not worth a war with France to save, and so to the end of the order. At the Council of Vienne in 1312, with the king encamped nearby with an army for emphasis, Clement issued the bull Vox in excelso. Read it closely. Historians always point this out, and it matters. The Pope did not convict the Templars. He wrote that the order could not be convicted on the evidence, and abolished it anyway, not by way of judicial sentence, but by way of provision or apostolic ordinance. Administratively, the way one dissolves a company, not the way one condemns a criminal. The order's property, over the king's objections, was assigned to the Hospitallers, though Philip extracted enormous expenses first, and in Spain and Portugal, as we'll see, other arrangements were made. Nearly 200 years of the Temple ended in a paragraph of legal Latin. There remained only the men. Most brothers in the end were pensioned off. That's the strange, quiet epilogue almost nobody knows. The ordinary Templars of Europe were not exterminated. Outside France, in England, Aragon, Cyprus, Germany, tribunals had found little or nothing. Often no torture was used, and most brothers were assigned small pensions from the old estates and dispersed into other monastic houses, where they grew old grumbling, as one surviving record from Cyprus suggests about the food. History's endings are usually shabbier and gentler than legend allows, but not for the leaders. And so we come to the evening of the 18th of March, 1314, and to a small island in the Seine. The four highest officers of the dead order, de Maillet among them, 7 years in prison now, an old man near 70, were brought out before Notre Dame in Paris to hear their final sentence, perpetual imprisonment. The cardinals read it out from a platform, and then before the assembled crowd, Jacques de Maillet did the one great unexpected thing of his careful life. He spoke. He and the preceptor of Normandy, Geoffrey de Charny, standing there in front of everyone, took back their confessions. The order was holy, de Maillet declared. The confessions were lies wrung out by torture and fear, and his crime, his only crime, he said, was to have betrayed the temple by confessing falsely to save his life. Relapsed heretics. The label fell instantly, and the machine knew what to do with it. The king, told at once, did not wait for the churchmen. That same evening, the two old men were rowed out to a little island in the Seine, the Isle aux Juifs, near where the Pont Neuf stands today. If you visit Paris, there's a plaque down on the point of the Isle de la Cité, and tourists walk past it every day licking ice cream cones. And there, as the sun set over the river, they were burned. The witnesses, and we have several accounts, agree on the essentials. De Maillet asked to be turned to face the cathedral, toward Notre Dame, and to have his hands freed so he could hold them together in prayer. He told the executioners God would avenge the innocent. He made, the chronicler says, so gentle and firm an end that the crowd was shaken, and in the night people waited and rode out to gather ashes and bone as relics, the relics of a convicted heretic, mind you. Ordinary Parisians, whatever the placards said, had drawn their own conclusions. And then comes the coda that even sober historians can't resist because it simply happened. Within weeks, Pope Clement V was dead of a long illness in April. Within the year, Philip the Fair was dead too, a hunting accident, a stroke perhaps, at 46 in November. The Chronicle writers noticed. Of course they noticed. Later generations shaped it into the legend of the Grand Master's curse, summoning king and pope to meet him before God's tribunal within the year. The contemporary sources for an actual spoken curse are thin to non-existent. The famous wording comes from later writers, but the deaths are real, the dates are real, and you can't blame the Middle Ages for finding the pattern irresistible. Philip's 3 sons then died in turn without surviving male heirs. The Capetian line failed within a generation, and France slid toward the 100 Years' War. The accursed kings, novelists came to call them. Take a breath. Let the fire on that little island burn down, and the river carry the smoke away into the dark. The Templars were gone, and the moment they were gone, almost the very moment, something curious began. They started to grow, in memory, in story, in shadow. The real order died in 1312. The imagined order was just being born, and it is alive tonight, 7 centuries later, on your bookshelf and your movie screen. So for the last stretch of our night together, let's walk through the afterlife, the mysteries, the treasure, the myths, and gently sort what's real from what's dream. The afterlife, treasure, myths, and the long shadow. Let's start with the most famous question of all, the one that launched 1,000 paperback covers. What happened to the Templar treasure and the Templar fleet? Didn't ships slip out of the harbor at La Rochelle on the eve of the arrests, loaded with gold, bound for, take your pick, Scotland, Portugal, even America? Here's the honest answer, and I'll try to make honesty as cozy as legend. First, the treasure. Remember what we learned in the counting house. Templar wealth was overwhelmingly land and income, fields, mills, rents, flocks. You cannot smuggle a vineyard out of a harbor at midnight. The liquid wealth, the actual coin and plate in places like the Paris Temple, was seized in the arrests, inventoried by the king's men, and the inventories survive, and they are, from a treasure hunter's point of view, disappointingly ordinary. Philip took what there was, held the lands for years while administering them at ruinous fees, and eventually passed the remainder to the Hospitallers, who spent decades complaining with receipts that the whole affair had nearly bankrupted them. That, delightfully, is the true fate of the Templar fortune. It was largely consumed by lawyers, fees, and accounting. Some mysteries have the most mundane solutions imaginable. Second, the fleet. The records we have suggest the Templars owned only a modest number of ships. They were landlords and bankers far more than they were a navy. They chartered most of their shipping from the Italians. The La Rochelle Midnight Fleet story rests on essentially one thread, a single Templar's rambling testimony during the trials mentioning ships, spun centuries later into an armada. Could a few brothers with a bit of coin have slipped abroad in October 1307? Certainly, a handful escaped, as we said. Did a treasure fleet vanish into the Atlantic? There's simply nothing solid under that story. It's a beautiful ship, but it's made of fog. And yet, and this is where the afterlife gets genuinely interesting, some Templar survivals are completely real, and they're better than the fog. In Portugal, King Denis flatly declined to destroy an order that had helped build his country. He negotiated with the Pope, and in 1319 the Templars' Portuguese lands and in effect, their membership were rolled into a brand new order, the Order of Christ. Same castles, including the magnificent round-churched convent at Tamar, which you can walk through today, much continuity, new name. And here's the part I love telling Americans late at night. Generations later, Prince Henry the Navigator was a governor of the Order of Christ, and the caravels of Portuguese exploration sailed with the Order's red cross painted on their sails. When you picture the Age of Discovery, those little ships heading down the African coast and out into the Atlantic, you are, in a lineal, paperwork traceable sense, looking at the heraldic descendant of the Templar cross. No secret tunnels required. The truth is right there on the sails. In Spain, similarly, Aragon folded Templar assets into a new order, Montesa, to keep guarding the frontier. In Switzerland, in Scotland, where excommunicate King Robert the Bruce had little incentive to enforce papal bulls, individual fugitive brothers may well have found quiet corners to grow old in. Legend, of course, has them charging out of the mist to save the day at Bannockburn. The sources for that are, to put it gently, romantic and late, but a gray-bearded ex-Templar dying peacefully on a Scottish farm, entirely plausible. History prefers pensions to phantoms. Then there's Friday the 13th. You'll often hear that our superstition about the date comes straight from the arrests of 1307. It's almost too good, and it probably is too good. The documented fear of Friday the 13th really only shows up centuries later, and folklorists trace it to a much more recent braiding of two older threads, unlucky Fridays and unlucky 13s. But the coincidence is real. The actual verifiable date on those sealed orders was Friday, October the 13th. The legend borrowed a true fact and grew around it, the way a pearl grows around a grain of sand. Most Templar myths work exactly like that. The Freemasons. The claimed chain, fugitive Templars to Scottish lodges to modern Masonry, was largely invented in the 1700s, when a Scottish-born orator in France gave a famous speech tracing Masonry to Crusader knights, and German lodges ran with it, inventing rites with Templar Grand Masters in unbroken secret succession. Serious historians, including Masonic ones, find no documentary bridge across the 4-century gap. But as mythology, it was wildly successful, and it's the main pipe through which the Templars flowed into modern conspiracy culture, the Holy Grail guardianship, the bloodline theories, the bestsellers of the 1980s and 2000s, the video games where hooded assassins fight Templar masterminds across the centuries. Every generation, it seems, needs a secret order that knows what's really going on. The actual Templars, men who signed their names with crosses because they couldn't write, and worried in their rule about fair shares from a shared soup bowl, would, I suspect, be utterly bewildered by the job description. One more piece of the afterlife, and this one is solemn and real. In our own era, historians finally got what the Templars themselves begged for and never received, a fair reading of the evidence. The trial records, studied comprehensively, Malcolm Barber's work above all, and the Vatican's own Chinon parchment, published by the Archives in facsimile in 2007, have produced something close to a scholarly consensus. The charges were fabrications of a familiar type, assembled by Philip's lawyers from the standard medieval accusation kit. The same denials and desecrations had been alleged against other convenient targets and confirmed by torture. 700 years late, the verdict of history has come in, and it acquits them. The Vatican's publication of the parchment in 2007 was covered around the world under headlines about the Templars being cleared, an odd, gentle bit of justice arriving at the speed of archives. And if you want to touch the true story with your own hands, no myth, just stone, you still can. The Temple Church in London, round like the Holy Sepulchre, where the effigy of William Marshall, the greatest knight of the age and a Templar at his death, lies in the quiet light. The Convent of Christ at Tamar, the Paris district still called the Temple, where the street names remember the vanished tower. Castle ruins on the coast of Israel at Atlat, where the sea still folds over the rocks below the walls, exactly as it did when the mutton was in the pots and the bell rang out over the water. The stones are all still there, only the bell is silent. Winding down, what remains? We're near the end now, buddy, so let's let the story settle, the way you let tea leaves settle in a cup. 200 years, give or take. That's the whole span of the Order of the Temple, from the 9 poor knights in a borrowed corner of a Jerusalem palace to the old man praying toward Notre Dame through the smoke. Inside that span, an idea nobody had ever had before, a continent's worth of quiet farms, a banking network that ran a kingdom's treasury, castles like Atlat that were never taken, discipline that held formation at Montgisard and died of thirst at Hattin, and an ending built not of battle but of paperwork, torture, and a king's arithmetic. If you're drifting now, and I hope you are, let your mind wander back over the small things, because the small things are the true ones. 2 men sharing 1 horse on a wax seal, a lamp left burning all night in a dormitory so no brother wakes in the dark, a hand signal at a silent table asking for the salt, a tenth of the bread set aside for the poor, an old knight checking a girth strap in a warm stable at 4 in the morning, murmuring to a horse in the deep cold quiet between the night office and dawn. Institutions are mortal. Kingdoms are mortal. Even the mightiest bank in the world can be closed by sunrise on a single Friday. But the ordinary hours, the meals, the bells, the work, the small kindnesses written into the rules, those are the parts of any life, theirs or ours, that were really lived. Everything else is just the story that gets told afterward. And now the fire's gone to embers and the story's told. If you're still with me, thank you for keeping me company tonight. And if you've already drifted off somewhere back around the counting houses of Paris, well, that's the nicest compliment this channel ever gets. If these long, quiet journeys into the past help you rest, it would truly mean a lot if you'd subscribe, and maybe tap the like button so more tired people can find their way here. If you'd like, leave a comment and tell me where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there. I love reading them in the morning, this little map of night owls scattered across the dark side of the planet. Next time we'll wander somewhere quiet again, another corner of history where the lamps are low and nothing needs anything from you. But that's for another night. For now, let go of the Templars, let go of the day, let go of tomorrow for a little while. Sleep well, buddy. Good night.